There is a number that Washington does not want you to know, not because it is classified, not because it is buried behind 17 layers of security clearance in a government database that only senior officials with the appropriate access level are permitted to read, but because the moment you understand what that number means, the entire story that the White House has been telling about its trade war with Canada collapses in on itself like a building whose foundation was quietly removed while everyone was watching the front door. And foundations, once removed, do not grow back on anyone's political timeline. The number is $3.1 billion. That is the value of the agreement that Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney signed with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi on a Tuesday morning in New Delhi, while the financial news channels in Washington were still running chyrons about Trump's latest tariff threat, while White House communications staff were drafting press releases about economic dominance and inevitable capitulation, while the President of the United States was on a telephone call threatening to impose 100% tariffs on every Canadian product that crosses the border, while trade hawks in the West Wing were celebrating what they believed was the slow economic strangulation of a nation that had dared to push back against the most powerful economic apparatus on Earth. While all of that noise was filling every screen and every speaker in the most powerful city on Earth, a quiet man in a dark suit sat across a mahogany table in the Indian capital and signed his name to a document that will reshape the global supply chain for critical minerals for the next 15 years. Not 12 years, not 10, 15, 3 presidential terms, an entire generation of industrial planning locked into place with the stroke of a pen on a Tuesday morning that most of Washington never even registered as significant. And when Warren Buffett heard about that signing, he did not call a press conference. He did not post on social media. He did not give a statement to Reuters or the Wall Street Journal or appear on television to explain his thinking. He picked up a telephone, made 3 calls to his portfolio managers, and by the end of that trading session, Berkshire Hathaway had quietly increased its exposure to Canadian resource assets by a figure that his own team described internally as the most concentrated single-day allocation in the firm's history since September of 2008. We will come back to what Buffett did and why he did it. We will come back to what September 2008 has to do with a Tuesday morning in New Delhi. We will come back to those 3 phone calls and what the portfolio positions they generated tell you about where the smartest money on Earth believes the next decade of economic power is actually located. But first, you need to understand what was actually signed in that working room in the Indian capital, because the mainstream media reported it as a trade agreement. They called it a diplomatic milestone. They ran it for 40 seconds between a segment on inflation data and a segment on the domestic political calendar. And in doing so, they missed the single most consequential economic document of the entire US-Canada confrontation, possibly of the entire decade. This was not a trade agreement. This was the moment Canada stopped needing the United States. Let me take you inside the room where it happened, not the ceremonial room with the flags and the cameras and the handshakes staged for the photographers, not the grand hall where Carney and Modi stood side by side for the wire photos that ran on the inside pages of the international newspapers. The working room, the room where the actual architecture of power is assembled in silence. The room where Carney's trade team and Modi's resource ministers spent 3 days going through a document line by line, paragraph by paragraph, clause by clause, a document that had been in active negotiation for 11 months across 4 time zones and 2 of the world's most complex bureaucratic systems. A document that covers lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earth elements, and uranium. A document with 15-year binding supply commitments, with price floor mechanisms that protect Canadian producers from market volatility, with logistics frameworks specifying shipping routes and processing protocols and quality standards down to the molecular level. A document with enforcement provisions so detailed that a trade lawyer who reviewed a summary of its terms told the Globe and Mail it was the most comprehensively drafted bilateral resource agreement he had seen in 30 years of practice. A document with a joint processing facility clause that will see 2 new industrial plants built on Canadian soil with Indian capital before the end of this decade. Facilities that will employ thousands of Canadians and anchor the critical mineral processing industry in a way that no domestic government investment had ever managed to achieve on its own. $3.1 billion is the headline figure, but the headline figure is almost irrelevant because the strategic value of what was signed is measured not in dollars but in decades, not in immediate cash flows but in the structural repositioning of an entire nation's resource economy away from a single vulnerable dependency and toward a diversified platform with genuine global reach. The $3.1 billion is the entry price. The value being captured is measured in the trillions of industrial output those minerals will enable over the next generation. Here is what you need to understand about critical minerals. Not the economics textbook version that politicians recite in committee hearings when they are trying to sound informed. The real version. The version that defense contractors and semiconductor manufacturers and electric vehicle engineers understand with a clarity that most politicians never achieve. Critical minerals are not commodities in the traditional sense. They are not like oil, where if one supplier cuts you off, you can call 3 others and get the price you need before your refineries go dry. They are not like wheat or soybeans or copper, materials whose production can be expanded relatively quickly in response to price signals. Critical minerals are choke points. They are the narrow passages through which the entire architecture of the modern economy must flow. And whoever controls those passages controls not just the present but the future, because the future runs on these materials in ways that the present only partially understands. The United States Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency maintains a list, not publicly released in its entirety, but what is leaked through congressional testimony, defense procurement documents, and the selective disclosures that inevitably emerge from any large bureaucratic system over time is enough to paint a picture that should make every American taxpayer lose sleep. That list contains the materials without which the following systems cannot be manufactured at scale, at any price, under any timeline, regardless of how many executive orders the president signs or how many billions the Defense Production Act redirects. The F-35 Lightning II, the most advanced multi-role fighter aircraft in the history of aerial combat, the centerpiece of American air superiority doctrine for the next 4 decades, Virginia-class submarines, the backbone of America's underwater deterrent capability, Patriot missile defense batteries, Javelin anti-tank systems, the entire GPS satellite constellation that underpins civilian aviation, global shipping, financial transaction timing, and the operational logic of every smartphone on Earth, advanced radar arrays, hypersonic research platforms, the next generation of directed energy systems, the communications backbone of the entire Department of Defense. The list goes on. And almost every item on it contains a mineral that the United States does not produce in sufficient domestic quantity to meet its own defense requirements without importing from external sources. For years, the Pentagon's answer to this structural vulnerability was Canada, the country that sits above the United States on the map and that happens to contain some of the richest deposits of these critical materials anywhere on Earth. Canadian lithium from the shores of James Bay, a region where the ancient Precambrian shield contains mineral concentrations that geologists describe as extraordinary even by global standards. Canadian cobalt from the mining belt of northern Ontario, where known deposits suggest production capacity sufficient to supply global demand for decades. Canadian nickel from the Sudbury Basin, a geological formation so extraordinarily dense with the material that scientists once theorized it was the remnant of an ancient meteor impact, a basin whose nickel output has fed global industrial manufacturing for over a century. Canadian rare earth elements from deposits in Quebec and British Columbia representing some of the largest proven reserves outside of China. Canadian uranium from the Athabasca Basin in Saskatchewan, the highest grade deposits in the world, feeding nuclear power plants on 4 continents. The relationship between the United States and Canada on these materials was so deeply embedded, so structurally integrated into the supply chains of American defense and technology manufacturing, that most people in Washington simply never thought about it. It was infrastructure, the kind of thing that works invisibly when it works and becomes catastrophic only when it stops. It was like breathing. You do not think about the air, you do not examine it or value it or build contingency plans for its absence. You breathe, and then someone takes it away. And then Trump imposed the tariffs. And then Carney opened a folder labeled Scenario Maximum. And then, 11 months later on a Tuesday morning in New Delhi, the air started moving in a different direction, permanently. The India deal is not a single transaction. Understanding it as a transaction is the mistake that Washington made and the mainstream media repeated without examination. A transaction is reversible. You can renegotiate a transaction with more money, better terms, political concessions. This is a restructuring, and restructurings change the underlying architecture of a system. Once the architecture has been reshaped, the old configuration does not simply reassemble itself because someone requests it to. 70% of Canada's rare earth element exports, previously flowing south through integrated North American supply chains into American manufacturing facilities, will now flow east into Indian industrial networks under the terms of this agreement. The lithium that was destined for battery plants in the American Midwest will instead feed the gigafactories India is building in Gujarat and Rajasthan. The cobalt compounds that American defense manufacturers purchased through Canadian processors will now be processed in joint Canadian-Indian facilities and sold into Asian and European European markets first, with American buyers competing for whatever remains at prices those markets establish. The nickel alloys that feed into everything from stainless steel to advanced battery cathodes will follow the same eastward trajectory. The 15-year binding commitment is not a suggestion. It has penalty clauses with specific financial consequences for breach, arbitration mechanisms specifying the forum, the governing law, and the available remedies, sovereign guarantee provisions meaning the governments of Canada and India themselves stand behind the commitments, not just the commercial entities executing them. Renegotiating it would require both governments to agree, and both governments just spent 11 months designing it specifically so that no third-party pressure could unilaterally undo what was built, including the United States of America. This is the detail the White House missed. Not the signing itself, though they missed that too. The architecture. The agreement was not written to be renegotiated. It was written to be permanent. Written the way that central bankers write things, the way that people who have spent careers inside the machinery of global financial systems write things, with the assumption that the document will outlast the political moment, with the understanding that enforceability matters more than rhetoric surrounding a commitment, with the knowledge that the clauses that appear to be legal boilerplate are actually the most important words on the page. Carney governs by architecture, Trump governs by announcement. Over the course of this confrontation, the world has been given a graduate-level education in the difference between those two approaches and which one leaves lasting marks on the terrain of economic power. Now let us translate this into numbers that touch the daily economic life of ordinary Americans. Numbers that appear not in diplomatic cables or defense procurement documents, but in the prices paid at car dealerships, the cost of electricity, the availability of medicines, and the long-term competitiveness of American manufacturing. The F-35 program represents $1.7 trillion over its operational lifetime, larger than the GDP of Australia. Every F-35 contains cobalt in its electromagnetic interference suppression systems, rare earth elements in its radar-absorbing structural materials, nickel alloys in its engine turbine components, lithium in its onboard power management and avionics. The processing capacity for those materials that feeds American defense manufacturing runs through Canadian industrial facilities that have been integrated into those supply chains for so long the integration became invisible. When Canadian exports redirect toward India, American defense contractors do not simply find another supplier. They enter a global spot market competing against the Indian defense industry, the European defense industry, and the Chinese industrial complex simultaneously, all bidding for supply already constrained before 70% of it was locked into 15-year contracts elsewhere. The Pentagon's own assessment projects the cost increase for critical mineral inputs to American defense manufacturing at between $40 and $60 billion added to total weapons platform costs over the next decade. Not a one-time expense, a recurring annual premium on the cost of American military power, a premium that will appear in defense appropriations bills labeled supply chain resilience investments, a premium that will never be labeled what it actually is, which is the price of starting a trade war with the country that supplies your military's raw materials without first checking whether you could actually replace that supply. The electric vehicle story is equally concrete and equally direct. General Motors has committed $35 billion to EV development. Ford has committed $50 billion. Every major American automaker has restructured its entire future around a battery technology requiring lithium, cobalt, and nickel at industrial scale. The Inflation Reduction Act created $269 billion in incentives to anchor those supply chains in North America rather than in China. The batteries in every electric vehicle sold in America today trace their material origin at some point in the supply chain to Canadian mining and processing operations. As Canadian critical mineral exports shift toward India and Asia, the American EV industry will face a materials cost increase passed directly to consumers. Analysts at Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley have independently reached similar projections after reviewing the terms of the Canada-India agreement. American consumers could see electric vehicle battery costs increase by between $800 and $1,400 per vehicle within 3 years. That is not a marginal adjustment. That is the difference between an electric vehicle that is price competitive with a gasoline car and one that is not. And it arrives precisely when the American government is trying hardest to push consumers toward adoption. The policy incentive and the supply chain reality are now moving in opposite directions. And supply chains, in the end, move slower than political calendars, but faster than political reversals. The semiconductor story tells the same logic at a different industrial scale. The CHIPS Act represents $280 billion invested to rebuild domestic chip manufacturing on American soil. New fabs being built by TSMC in Arizona, Intel in Ohio, Samsung in Texas. The ambition is to reshore the advanced chip fabrication capability that migrated to Asia over 30 years. What the congressional debates over the CHIPS Act did not fully account for was the materials dependency embedded in advanced semiconductor fabrication. Rare earth elements required for the planarization processes that make chip surfaces flat enough at the nanometer scale to accept circuit patterns. Specialty nickel compounds used in deposition steps. Cobalt materials used in interconnect layers of the most advanced chip architectures. All of them with supply chains running through Canadian processing facilities. As those chains reprice under the India Agreement, the competitive advantage the CHIPS Act was designed to create narrows in ways its architects did not plan for and cannot fully address after the fact. The green energy story extends the same logic to the infrastructure of the energy transition itself. The offshore wind turbines being deployed along the eastern seaboard, the utility-scale battery storage systems being commissioned across the American West, the grid modernization programs designed to carry renewable power from generation sites to consumption centers, all of them require critical mineral inputs that American domestic production cannot currently supply at the required volumes. The Inflation Reduction Act created incentive structures that assumed Canadian supply would remain available at integrated North American prices. That assumption is now invalid. The cost models built into every renewable energy project currently in the American permitting pipeline will need to be revised upward to reflect the new supply reality. Projects that penciled at the old prices will not pencil at the new ones. Some will be delayed, some will be canceled. And the energy transition that American climate policy depends upon will proceed more slowly and at greater cost than the projections embedded in the legislation that authorized it. All of this because of a trade war launched against the country that supplied the materials the transition requires. Now let us talk about India, because India is not simply a buyer in this story. India is a platform. And understanding what it means for Canada to have aligned itself structurally with that platform at this specific moment in the arc of India's economic development is what separates the surface reading of this agreement from the strategic depth Carney was operating from when he spent 11 months building it. India today is the world's most populous nation, 1.4 billion people. A median age of 28 years, meaning the largest working-age population in human history, is only now reaching its peak productive years, an economy growing at approximately 7% annually for the better part of a decade. The International Monetary Fund projects India will become the world's third largest economy by nominal GDP before 2030, a country in the midst of one of the most ambitious infrastructure build-outs in human history, adding highway kilometers, railway lines, port facilities, power generation capacity, and urban housing at rates that strain the descriptive capacity of statistics. And all of it requires critical minerals. The steel framing the buildings contains nickel. The electric vehicles Modi's government is deploying across Indian cities require lithium and cobalt. The semiconductor fabs India is building in its own industrial policy initiative require rare earth elements. The defense modernization program seeking to reduce dependence on Russian military equipment requires exactly the materials that American defense manufacturing also requires. India's critical mineral demand is not a future projection. It is a present reality growing at 7% per year on a base of 1.4 billion people. Canada sits on the materials that India needs at the exact moment when India needs them most urgently. That geological coincidence meeting that demographic reality meeting that political opening created by Trump's trade war is the foundation on which the $3.1 billion agreement was built. The nation that builds a structural supply relationship with India now, before industrial demand reaches its ceiling, will hold a position comparable to the nations that locked in Middle Eastern oil relationships in the 1970s. Those early relationships compounded for decades. Revenues funded development, influence funded geopolitics, dependency created leverage that persisted through wars and price shocks and regime changes because it was built into the physical infrastructure of supply in ways that could not be quickly dismantled. Canada is building that kind of relationship with India around critical minerals, and it is building it on the schedule that India's growth demands, which is now. There is a concept that financial historians use when analyzing the great resource alignment moments of the 20th century. They call it the first mover premium. The nations and companies that establish supply relationships with rapidly industrializing economies before the competition arrives capture a structural advantage that compounds over time in ways that late entrants can never fully replicate, regardless of how much capital they eventually deploy. The Japanese steel industry that locked in Australian iron ore relationships in the 1960s. The American oil oil majors that established Gulf partnerships in the 1940s and 50s. The Chinese rare earth processing dominance built through decades of patient state investment before the Western world understood what was being assembled. Canada, in signing this agreement, is claiming the first mover premium with the world's largest and fastest-growing industrial economy at the beginning of its critical mineral demand curve. Not at the peak when prices are highest and competition most fierce, but at the beginning when the relationship can be built on terms that reflect Canadian supply strength and Indian growth urgency in equal measure. 15 years from now, when India's EV fleet has scaled to hundreds of millions of vehicles and its semiconductor fabs have reached fabrication nodes requiring the most specialized material inputs, the supply relationships established in New Delhi on that Tuesday morning will be so deeply integrated into Indian industrial infrastructure that no competitor can simply arrive with a better offer and displace what was built. The plants will have been operating for a decade, the logistics chains refined through thousands of shipments, the quality standards calibrated through years of operational partnership. The institutional relationships between Canadian resource companies and Indian industrial groups will have developed the mutual dependency and institutional memory that make established supply chains almost impossible to displace even when theoretically superior alternatives exist. That is what was purchased in New Delhi for $3.1 billion, and Washington, consumed by the noise of its own tariff announcements, missed the moment entirely. There is one dimension of the agreement that mainstream analysis has almost entirely missed: the Joint Processing Facility Clause. 2 new industrial plants built on Canadian soil with Indian capital before the end of this decade. Not mining facilities, finishing plants. The facilities where raw critical mineral inputs are transformed into the high-specification materials that defense contractors and battery manufacturers actually require. Lithium hydroxide monohydrate, the form battery cathodes need. Cobalt sulfate for battery chemistry. Rare earth oxides refined to defense-grade purity. This matters because the most valuable part of the critical mineral supply chain is not the mining. Mining is capital-intensive and technically demanding, but it is the least differentiated stage. The value accumulates in the processing. A ton of lithium ore is worth a fraction of what battery-grade lithium hydroxide is worth. Historically, the value-added processing in North American critical mineral chains happened in American facilities. Canada sold raw material. America processed it. America captured the margin. The joint processing facilities in the new agreement changed that arithmetic permanently. Over 15 years, the value transferred from American supply chain economics to Canadian and Indian economics through this single clause is measurable in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Now let us return to Buffett, because closing the loop is where the geopolitical analysis translates into the language that actually moves capital and reveals what the smartest money in the world understood months before the rest of the market caught up. 9 months before the India agreement was signed, Berkshire Hathaway began a quiet and systematic reallocation of a portion of its $381.6 billion cash reserve, distributed across multiple vehicles and jurisdictions in a pattern visible only in retrospect when the investment positions were mapped against the timeline of the Canada-India negotiation. Energy royalty trusts tied to Canadian resource extraction, critical mineral streaming agreements with Canadian mining operators, infrastructure vehicles linked to the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion and Pacific LNG terminal developments, European industrial companies with downstream exposure to Canadian rare earth inputs, Indian conglomerate positions with joint venture relationships in the Canadian resource sector that had been under negotiation for, as it happens, approximately 11 months. Buffett did not have the negotiating documents. He did not have a source inside either government. What he had was the pattern recognition built across 70 years of watching capital flow through systems under pressure. And the pattern he identified 9 months before the rest of the world saw the agreement was precisely the pattern he had seen before. In September of 2008, when Goldman Sachs called and needed $5 billion in 48 hours, in 2008, the asset was Goldman's irreplaceable franchise in global capital markets. The crisis was the financial collapse. The fundamental value was clear to anyone who understood the underlying structure and was not distracted by the emotional noise of the moment. Every other major investor on Wall Street was paralyzed by uncertainty. The screens were red. The language coming from every corner of the financial world was the language of systemic collapse and irreversible damage. Buffett looked at the same information and saw something different. He saw a franchise that would survive, a business model that would endure, and a price set by fear rather than by value. He invested $5 billion not because he was brave, but because he was prepared. The investment thesis was written before the crisis. The crisis was the trigger, not the idea. In the Canada-India situation, the asset was Canadian critical mineral supply chains. The crisis was the trade war and the economic pressure that had driven Canadian resource asset prices to levels reflecting uncertainty and fear rather than the underlying geological and strategic reality. The fundamental value was the irreplaceability of those minerals at a moment when demand from every major growth sector was converging simultaneously on a supply that was finite, geographically concentrated, and increasingly redirected away from the buyer that had historically suppressed its price through structural leverage. Buffett established his position not because he had special information, but because he had read the structure correctly, identified the mispricing the crisis had created, and recognized the window before the rest of the market understood that the window existed. At an investor briefing in Omaha, when asked directly about the India agreement and Berkshire's positioning, Buffett was characteristically precise. When Canada signed that agreement with India, he said, they did not just redirect a supply chain, they repriced themselves. They moved from being a supplier to the American market, where structural dependency had suppressed the price below its true strategic value, to being a strategic partner to the Indian market, where they are indispensable and where the price will reflect that indispensability. The difference between being taken for granted and being indispensable is not a small difference. It is the difference between a commodity price and a strategic premium. And strategic premiums are permanently higher. They do not revert to commodity prices simply because someone demands that they do. He paused in the way that veteran Berkshire observers have learned means the most important sentence is still coming. I have spent my career identifying assets mispriced relative to their structural value, he continued. Canada's critical mineral sector at the moment I began building our position was one of the most dramatically mispriced strategic asset classes I have encountered in 7 decades of investing. The reason was simple. The asset was embedded in a relationship where the buyer held enough structural leverage that the price never had to reflect actual scarcity. The buyer did not need to pay a strategic price because the seller had no credible alternative. When the buyer's own behavior forced the seller to find and develop alternatives, the true price discovered itself very quickly. That is what happened in New Delhi. And the price that was discovered will govern this market for the next 15 years. It is a very different price from the one Washington was paying. He removed his glasses. In my business, we say price is what you pay and value is what you get. For decades, America was paying commodity prices for strategic value on Canadian critical minerals. The India agreement ended that arrangement permanently. Anyone still pricing Canadian resource assets at the old commodity price will have a very difficult time explaining their portfolio in 3 years. When asked whether he had any message for the trade policy architects in Washington, the people who had created the conditions leading to the India agreement without apparently understanding what those conditions would produce, Buffett thought for a moment longer than usual. In every negotiation I have ever been part of, he said, the most expensive mistake you can make is to believe the other side has no options. The belief that Canada had no options was the foundation of the tariff strategy. It was wrong. And it was wrong in a way that is now permanently embedded in 15 years of binding contracts. You cannot rescind those contracts with a press release. You cannot undo them with a tariff rollback. You cannot offer enough money to replace what has been built, because what was built is not a transaction, it is a relationship, and relationships established at this scale develop their own gravity. They pull more investment, more cooperation, more integration toward them over time. They compound. And compounding, as I have said many times before, is the most powerful force in the universe. $3.1 billion. That is the number Washington does not want you to know. But now you know it. And knowing it, you understand something that the most powerful political office on earth apparently did not understand on the Tuesday morning when a quiet man in a dark suit sat across a mahogany table in New Delhi and changed the economic architecture of the next generation. You cannot demand ownership of something you did not build. You cannot threaten leverage you do not hold. You cannot ignore for 11 months the negotiations happening in plain sight between the country you are pressuring and the 1.5 billion person market waiting to receive everything you chose to push away. The signal was always New Delhi. The noise was always Washington. And signals in the end are the only things that last. If you understand that the real power in a resource confrontation belongs not to the loudest voice but to the quietest signature, write receipt in the comments below. Subscribe and hit the notification bell because the next chapter of this story is already being written. The Democratic Economic Compact holds its first formal summit in 30 days. India is expected to apply for observer status. The Pacific LNG terminal breaks ground before the end of the quarter, and somewhere in a government building in Ottawa, the next folder is already open. The question is not whether Washington will notice in time. The question is whether it matters anymore if they do. The contracts are signed, the concrete is being poured, the processing facilities are being designed, the supply chains are already moving east. And the arithmetic, as it always does, will do what it has always done throughout this entire confrontation. It will ignore the noise completely. It will follow the receipts to wherever they lead. And the receipts, every single one of them, point to New Delhi. That is the story of a Tuesday morning that Washington missed. That is the story of $3.1 billion that changed the economic architecture of a generation. That is the story of what happens when the loudest country in the room picks a fight with the quietest one, and the quiet one has already been building the exits for 11 months. The exits are built, the doors are open, and the most powerful nation on earth is standing outside, demanding to be let back in, still not entirely certain what room it was in to begin with. The receipt is on the table, the numbers are real, and the argument, as it always was over before it began.